There's a specific kind of exhaustion that hits when you're invited somewhere and your first thought isn't, what will I wear? It's, what's my excuse? Not because you're depressed, not because you're anxious, not because you hate your friends, but because somewhere deep in your chest, a quiet voice whispers, I just want to be alone. And for years, you've been told that voice is wrong, that wanting solitude means something is broken, that humans are social animals, and if you prefer quiet, you must be lonely or avoidant or antisocial or secretly sad. But what if that voice isn't broken? What if it's the healthiest part of you? Here's what psychologists are finally starting to understand. There's a massive difference between being lonely and being alone. Loneliness feels like hunger. It's an ache that reaches toward other people. Solitude feels like a deep breath. It's a space you return to. And in 2016, researchers at the University of Buffalo, led by Dr. Julie Bowker, started asking a question that somehow no one had asked properly before. What if some people simply prefer solitude? Not because they're wounded, not because they're scared, not because they're antisocial, but because being alone genuinely feels good to them. They named this pattern unsociability. And that word matters, because unsociable doesn't mean avoidant. Avoidant means you want connection, but fear it. Unsociable means you're capable of connection. You just don't always need it. When they studied people who naturally preferred solitude, the results surprised them. These individuals weren't struggling socially. They weren't depressed. They weren't hiding from life. In many cases, they were thriving. Emotionally stable, highly creative, deeply reflective, lower levels of aggression, lower levels of social comparison, higher levels of self-awareness, which raised a much deeper question. What's actually happening inside the brain of someone who genuinely enjoys being alone? Part of the answer lives in your dopamine system. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that signals reward and pleasure. For highly social people, interactions trigger strong dopamine releases. The laughter, the energy, the buzz of conversation, it literally feels rewarding to them. But for people who prefer solitude, the dopamine system is calibrated differently. Their brain reaches satisfaction faster. They don't need as much external input to feel mentally full. Imagine two people eating the same meal. One needs a full plate to feel satisfied. The other feels full after a few bites. Neither is wrong. Their bodies are just tuned differently. The same is true for social stimulation. A quiet room, a book. For some brains, that's already enough. But dopamine is only part of the story. Brain imaging studies show something else happening during solitude. The default mode network becomes active. This is the part of the brain that activates when you're not focused on external tasks. And here's what's fascinating. The default mode network is responsible for some of the mind's most sophisticated functions, integrating past experiences, understanding your own emotions, forming your sense of self, making meaning out of your life. Which means when you're alone, your brain isn't idle. It's doing its deepest work. Think about the last time a breakthrough idea arrived. Was it in a crowded room, or in the shower, on a walk, lying in bed, unable to sleep? Those quiet moments aren't empty. They're where your mind finally has space to think. This pattern appears throughout history. Albert Einstein called solitude the birthplace of creativity. He would spend hours alone on a sailboat doing absolutely nothing, not thinking about physics, just floating. And then ideas would arrive. Isaac Newton developed calculus and optics during a 2-year period of near total isolation when Cambridge closed due to plague. He called it his most creative period. Virginia Woolf wrote that a woman needs money and a room of her own to write fiction. Not luxury, not fame, just space. Maya Angelou would rent hotel rooms in her own town, not to sleep, to sit alone with words. She said she needed a space where no one could find her. But here's what's often misunderstood. Enjoying solitude doesn't mean rejecting relationships. Psychologist Bella DePaulo studied people who live and spend time alone by choice. She found they often maintain rich, meaningful connections with friends, family, and community. The difference is they're connecting from scarcity. They're not clinging because they feel incomplete without others. They connect because they genuinely want to. And that shifts the entire quality of their relationships. You're not searching for someone to complete you, you're sharing your life while already feeling whole. But psychologists also noticed something crucial. Not all solitude is the same. Abraham Maslow distinguished between healthy solitude and defensive isolation. Healthy solitude comes from abundance. You spend time alone because you feel comfortable with yourself. You know connection is available, you simply don't need it constantly. Defensive isolation comes from fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of vulnerability. From the outside, both look identical, a person sitting alone, a quiet weekend, but internally they feel completely different. One feels like peace, the other feels like protection. One feels like returning home, the other feels like hiding. That's why psychologists say the real question isn't whether someone likes being alone. The question is why. Are you running from people or returning to yourself? And interestingly, many cultures have understood this long before psychology named it. In Japan, there's a concept called hitori. It simply means choosing to spend time alone, not as rejection, as preference. Another Japanese idea is the space between things, the silence between notes in music, the pause in conversation, the emptiness that gives meaning its shape. In Scandinavian countries, there's friluftsliv, the deep peace of being alone in nature, walking through forests, breathing cold air, feeling small in a large world. German culture gives us Waldeinsamkeit, the mysterious calm of being alone in the woods. Not lonely, just present, surrounded by silence that doesn't feel empty. In Italy, they say dolce far niente, the sweetness of doing nothing. Not laziness, not avoidance, the gentle pleasure of existing without pressure. And ancient Greek philosophers spoke of eudaimonia, a kind of happiness that doesn't come from pleasure or status, it comes from understanding who you are and living in alignment with your nature. Across cultures, the message is the same. Solitude is not emptiness, it is space. And in that space, something important happens. You begin to hear your own thoughts more clearly. You begin to understand your own emotions. You begin to notice who you are without the noise of constant interaction. Psychologists call this self-differentiation. It's the ability to hold your own identity even when others disagree or disapprove. And it's one of the strongest markers of emotional maturity. When you're comfortable alone, your sense of self comes from within. You know who you are even when no one is watching. You don't shapeshift to fit every room. You don't need constant reassurance. You move through relationships differently, not desperate, not performative, just present. That quiet confidence changes everything. So if you're someone who genuinely enjoys being alone sometimes, if quiet evenings feel more restorative than crowded rooms, if solitude feels like coming home rather than being left out, there's a good chance your brain simply understands something many people spend their whole lives learning, that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. Loneliness is reaching for something outside yourself and not finding it. Solitude is discovering that everything you need was already inside. The noise fades, your thoughts slow down, your breathing changes, and somewhere in that quiet space, you finally meet yourself. Not the version you perform for others, not the version you think you should be, just you, sitting in your own company and realizing this has always been enough.